brilliant panel. I'm Danny Kruger, MP for Devizes, and I'm also recently appointed to PPS, the most junior role at the Department for Levelling Up Communities and Housing. And I am delighted to be able to come and listen to you all and to our panel to help us develop this great national mission we have to level up our country. And want to commend a couple of reports to you quickly. First, this one, which a group of colleagues, including Miriam here, have written, which is about much the same themes around how do we support the levelling up agenda, particularly by trusting local communities to take back control of their places. Also, the work that Onward have just published called Turnaround, which is about helping to revive what we shouldn't call left behind neighbourhoods. And I like this theme, turning around, levelling up. There's a sort of dance move in there. Imagine us all like synchronised swimmers emerging, twisting into a more prosperous future. So anyway, turning around or levelling up, whichever way around we want to describe it, we know what we want to achieve, which is a more regionally equal country where all our towns and cities have comparable opportunities for people growing up in them, and particularly echo the point that Michael Gove made this weekend, which is that you should not have to leave the place you love to have the life you want. I'm not going to introduce everyone now, I'm going to just go straight in. Very, very distinguished panel. I'm going to ask Brandon to speak first. Needs no introduction, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Going to talk to us about his experience there, but also in his own patch. About the great question before us is how do we support the needs of left behind places? What is holding places back? What works and what doesn't in turning them around? A few minutes from you, Brandon. We're going to whiz through the panel and then we're going to go straight into questions and comments from the floor. Over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Look, thank you to Onward for putting this together. I'm delighted to have a chance to be involved in this, because as somebody who comes from local government originally myself, I was always very much of the view, and one of the first things I did in Parliament as a backbench MP was sit on the Localism Act that then the DCLG was taking under Eric Pickles. So I came from that world of believing and understanding and wanting to see more devolution to local authorities. I think it is right, because no matter how well-meaning and how well-advised and how well-informed any of us may be in Whitehall, it is the people who are most local who really understand what is needed locally. And I think that is absolutely right. It's something I see, and I think it is important that we do everything we can as a party to ensure that people see wherever they're from, whatever their background. I say this to somebody whose mum's from Dagenham and dad's from Shepherd's Bush, which would have been seen as pretty tough areas in their childhood. The ability to have an opportunity to succeed. And I see this in Great Yarmouth, in my constituency. I've got 2 of the top 10 most deprived wards in the country. But what I've seen over the last few years is already, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, a real shift. And it's a shift that's coming about because of people being empowered locally to make a difference. Initially, with the schools. We had some of the worst performing schools around, really letting down the children and their families and the community. And as they've moved to academies, having that power and that autonomy to be able to make decisions that are in the interest of those pupils, led by the experts who know the area and know what their pupils need, we've seen a huge turnaround. So we're now seeing children going to Oxford and Cambridge and having an opportunity. The next big step for us in somewhere like Great Yarmouth is seeing the opportunity that's there, and it's just starting to come through to really develop on not just the offshore oil and gas, but offshore wind and renewables, that is really developing businesses that mean that those younger people, when they get those skills that are now being provided locally, can, as Danny rightly said, stay and live and work through their life in the place that they've come from, the place they want to be, the place we call home. And I'll be fairly brief to allow, so we can get on to the panel and questions, etc. But I will say, I see a similar thing in Great Yarmouth, and I see in Great Yarmouth in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is behind the rest of the UK economically before we got into COVID. It was already technically going into recession. We spent more UK government money per head than people in Northern Ireland than anywhere else in the UK. There's a much higher proportion of people in Northern Ireland who work for the public sector as opposed to the rest of the UK. It's about 27.5% against the average for the UK being 16.5%. And there are parts of Northern Ireland where we still have huge deprivation. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to see building back better and levelling up, really giving opportunity to people wherever they are, wherever they come from, so that young working class unionists and loyalists on the Shankill or nationalist supporters in the Cregan can see they have opportunity, because it's with that opportunity and the ability to earn money and have a good standard of living and prosperity that actually means that they are less likely to be attracted by dissident Republicans or criminal gangs on what they call themselves loyalist paramilitaries. I've got to tell you they're not, they're just drug dealers. But we've got to make sure there's opportunity there so that people have no reason to be attracted away from straight economic work. And therefore getting that opportunity, I think, through education, and that's where integrated education becomes so important in Northern Ireland. At the moment, only 7% of people benefit from that. We've got to move that forward to then see more businesses investing, creating more jobs. Again, actually, since we've left the European Union in the last couple of years, we are seeing that starting to happen. Some really exciting international businesses investing and growing in Northern Ireland. But it's that kind of thing that means that we can move away from a situation where, rather like Great Yarmouth traditionally, where good, smart people will go off to university and not come back, in Northern Ireland, they may study at Queen's University, which is fabulous, but they then tend to move to mainland UK. Belfast is now the second best place in the UK to invest in tech after London, top 25 in the world. We want to make sure more and more people are following the tech industry, where US companies are investing because students enjoy living there, they get their qualifications, they work and they stay, whereas Cambridge and Oxford, they tend to move quite quickly. We want to see more of that and develop that, but not just for Belfast. That's got to move more widely across Northern Ireland, Derry, Londonderry and Ballymena and places like that as well. So when we get that, then we really do see people having an opportunity that means they have better life chances, regardless of where they're from, and able to benefit from it where they are, and that's got to be the aim for us.
Fantastic. Not just Game of Thrones.
No. Or the line of duty.
Okay. Right, Rachel Wolfe is a very good friend of Onward and the Conservative Party and distinguished career.
Of yours.
And indeed mine. So co-author of the 2019 Election Manifesto and runs Public First. But crucially and most significantly, he was the founding director of the New Schools Network, which drove the Free Schools Revolution that Rand mentioned. Over to you, Rachel.
All right, I'll just make a few remarks. And I'm going to start with graffiti on the cenotaph and hanging baskets, which I get some flack for talking about. But I think when we go around, which we do a lot to some of these communities, and we talk to them about what they are looking for, I think you have to recognise that often what they are looking for seem like quite small things from Westminster, and they're about the fabric of their places seeming slightly dangerous, slightly run down. The reason they mention hanging baskets is they make comparisons with towns they go into and shop in, where hanging baskets are a symbol of somewhere that is being looked after. And I think when you think about levelling up communities, you do have to think about it in terms of these short-term wins, which demonstrate to people that they are on a path and they should trust you to continue on that path, while you're also thinking about some of these longer-term structural changes that you might need to make. And the other reason that I talk about things like graffiti on the cenotaph and hanging baskets is because they're precisely the sorts of things where you can imagine communities dealing with many of these challenges themselves. And what is notable to me is that in every single place that we talk to, there are things that are unique to that place that symbolise pride. They might be events, they might be cultural things, they might be how it looks, they might be monuments that symbolise local identity, and where I think giving communities the tools and the money to start dealing with some of these challenges can make a very, very big difference very fast. I think the second thing I wanted to talk about is free schools. Because when I founded the New Schools Network back in 2009, the most consistent view I got was that none would appear, that I would be very lucky if I saw half a dozen free schools emerge within a decade. And the reason for that, I think, was because people assumed that no one would go through what is an incredibly hard and laborious process of trying to found a new school in their community. And I think those people have been proved utterly and completely wrong. And they've been aided, the free school movement has been aided by clear funding and clear mechanisms from government. But most of all, it was a program that allowed latent talent and enthusiasm in places across the country to emerge. And I think one of the things that the levelling up agenda needs to do and I'm eagerly awaiting its precise definition in the paper, is to find ways to allow that native community to emerge. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about, because we're in Manchester, is red bricks. And one of the things that I love when we go to places like Manchester or Sheffield or Leeds or many of the great cities of the north are the great civic universities that are huge presences in the centre of these cities, and which were often founded by workers of the area, sometimes industrialists, and which were integrally linked to local government, local leadership. They trained those people, they provided skills training, many of them provided night schools. In the early civic universities, there were more casual evening students who were kind of late workers learning than there were young graduates. And they were civic institutions that were neither local government nor individuals themselves, but which formed an ecosystem. It seems to me deeply implausible that we're ever going to get back to that local ecosystem without serious devolution, and serious devolution both to local government but also institutions. But it is something that has been done very successfully. Because when we talk about left behind areas, they weren't always behind. When we talk to people in these areas, they often talk about things not necessarily 100 years ago, but 10 years ago, 30 years ago, which made their communities thrive. So I suppose attempting, possibly failing to bring those together. I think that there are huge short-term wins that demonstrate to places that it's worth sticking with this programme. And they are about how safe and nice places feel. I think there is an enormous amount, if we provide the mechanisms for communities, that they will deliver themselves. And I think that there is a long-term opportunity to really devolve power down, and without it, this will never be sustainable. But I am enormously optimistic, because while there are, of course, massive issues with productivity that, let's be honest, we do not know entirely how to solve. Productivity is not the only problem we have, and many of these problems are actually very tractable, and solutions exist within the places we're trying to help. So I think we should feel optimistic about what we can achieve.
Brilliant, Rachel, thank you very much. Paul Scully is the Minister at the Department for Business and also the Minister for London.
Indeed.
And London gets a bad rap. It's accused of sucking all the money and talent from the rest of the country, which we need to reverse. But is London part of the levelling up?
Yeah, absolutely, Danny, and congratulations on your new role. Have we worked out an acronym for it? I think the Deluxe is the one that I that's my working title, something like that. But it's a real pleasure to be here, and I think my snappiest thing that I've heard about what levelling up is that potential is equally distributed around the country, but opportunity isn't. So what more can we do to actually break down some of those barriers? And as Brandon said, have a whole government and a whole, not just national government solution. But Danny is, when he posed the question about London, they are not mutually exclusive. Levelling up the country does not mean levelling down London. And indeed, London itself needs levelling up. You can go from Westminster, where the four of us sit every day. If you go east on the Jubilee line, you lose a year of your life expectancy at every station that you travel towards the East End. So there's some really stark examples that you can see in London. But what we don't want to do is have that race over it's London versus the rest of the world. We don't want some sort of Game of Thrones King of the North camping up against London. We want to make sure that we can work together. And what does it mean? How are we going to work together in each individual area? It's about pride. So Rachel was talking about the hanging baskets and the cenotaph. If you remember, about 15, 20 years ago, when Rudy Giuliani was mayor of New York, he was talking about the broken windows situation. So if you have a broken window, nobody fixes it for a while, then that pride starts to go. Then graffiti comes. If you don't wash that off as quickly as possible, then that civic pride starts to go. And then you start getting those forgotten, those no-go areas, those forgotten neighbourhoods. So what more can we do to get in there very quickly to restore that civic pride? That's the local authorities working on their own place, but it's also that whole government approach and whole system approach, if you like. Productivity, that sits with me in Bays. A lot of this actually, it's how do we, first of all, allow people to start, grow and scale a business, which was in our manifesto. We want to make sure the UK is the best place to do that in the world. We need to go further than that. It should not matter where you are in the UK, it should still be your place should still be the best place to start growing the scale of business. That whether that's rural or urban, whether it's in Northern Ireland, Scotland, England or Wales, it should not matter. So you should be able to get good access to finance, good access to infrastructure, peer-to-peer networks, and mentoring as well. I don't mean Richard Branson on the end of the phone, I mean actually someone that's maybe gone through your business, what you're going through in your business, a couple of years ahead of you, so that it can start to tell you the good things to go through and and some of the pitfalls that you might want to avoid. And that's not all about geography, some of these barriers that we can break down when we're talking about starting a business. All of those things that I just outlined actually are the barriers that I keep hearing from people who I talk to about promoting more female entrepreneurs, more ethnic minority-led businesses, more disabled entrepreneurs, and young people as well. The answers, though, are quite different and nuanced. So that's why we need to make sure that we're shaping our place, but shaping the solutions for each of those barriers as well. But for those of people in work, rather than self-employed or starting a business, we want to make sure that we can offer good jobs. So another one of those phrases you keep hearing about building back better, but we're not going to do that on the back of the lowest paid in our society. So it's really important that we're offering quality jobs, and part of the good work report that we had a few years ago, I will be working to make flexible working the default option, so that you can request flexible working on day one. The consultation has just gone out. What does that mean for people that maybe don't have access to the workplace? It means more disabled people can get into work. It means people who can work around their childcare. People who are carers can actually access the workplace more, and that actually typically affects females over the age of 50. They're predominantly a high percentage of our carers. Infrastructure and connectivity is the obvious one. It's those sort of shovel-ready projects that we can make sure that we can get people connected. And this is one area actually, when you're trying to level up London, it's slightly easier to do, in so much that if the road networks and the rail networks are quite close together, so you're joining up, you're having to join up less far. Having said that, the property prices, the land prices are that much higher. The cost that's going into it is enormous. So we do need to have those projects where we're connecting up maybe villages and towns around other parts, in the rural parts of the country. And finally, social justice. Obviously, I've talked a little bit about health inequalities in London, and we've talked about education inequalities as well. So that will only be achieved by tackling it, as I say, as a whole government prospect. Thank you.
Cool, thank you very much. That's tremendous. Okay, Miriam, next to you, please. Miriam Gates, newly elected, well, 18 months ago, elected at the same time as me. Penniston and Stocksbridge, near Sheffield. Former teacher, went to Cambridge. Brandon says people don't stay in Cambridge. She went back to Sheffield. And is co-chair with me of the new social covenant unit, which is behind this essay. Miriam, because we're at the same rank, I can tell you, can you be a bit quicker than these ministers?
I think you're more senior than me, though, so I'm not sure if that means I should listen to you. Thank you. I just want to talk about 3 communities that I've been involved with to illustrate how levelling up is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and we need different approaches for different communities. So the first community I want to talk about is the village of Untitled, which is where I live. And I grew up in central Sheffield, but I moved out to Untitled, which is quite a rural village just out the north of Sheffield, about 13, 14 years ago. And Untitled is what I would call a high identity village. So it's geographically based, we all share the same park, the same church, the same pub, the same school. And although the main source of employment kind of died away about 15 years ago, it's the kind of village where people have moved out from the city to grow a family. And there's a really rich mix of people who've lived there all their lives, and grew up there, and their parents grew up there, and people who've more recently moved in the city. It's a very strong community. It's part of a flourishing and well-run parish council. And it's not that the village doesn't have issues, but there's plenty of resource within the village to solve those issues. People who like volunteering, a mixture of professionals and retired people, the parish council that we can call upon. And we've had some great investment from the private sector in terms of new shops. We've got lots of activists. And so although we do need resource in terms of better buses and things like that, the village mostly has the capacity to solve these problems on its own or with some sort of financial help. The next community I want to talk about is Stocksbridge, which is a steel town north of Untitled in my constituency. And Stocksbridge is a classic left-behind town, if we can call it that. So the steelworks used to employ 11,000 people. It now employs 750. But most of the community infrastructure, such that exists, was built by the steelworks, and it was once a very thriving town. But although Stocksbridge is lower capacity and lower resource, it's very high identity. So people still stay there, they live there, they don't move out, even though they perhaps could find better opportunities elsewhere. And the real turning point for Stocksbridge came about 7 or 8 years ago when the local authority closed the leisure centre, and there was uproar because this leisure centre was built in the 60s and 70s through public subscription. So there's a really strong community ownership of this leisure centre. And they got together, they saved it, they run it, it now makes a profit, it's outstanding in all sorts of ways. And off the back of that, we've won the Towns Fund, we've had £25 million to come together as a community and work out how to spend. So Stocksbridge certainly needs more intervention than Untitled. It's lower capacity and lower resource. But because it's got such a strong identity and because it's building capacity, essentially what it needs is money and a bit of guidance and a bit of help. So I would say they are kind of light touch approach to levelling up. Yes, we need help, but there is plenty of capacity within those communities. Third community that I worked with some years ago, I won't name it, but an inner city area in Sheffield. Firstly, not a strong identity, and I think this is a problem with some areas in cities. Perhaps towns and villages have a parish council, they have geographical borders. Not so clear in a city what a neighbourhood is, what a community is. And very low resource in terms of people with the potential to win funding, to organise, and low capacity. And I have a friend who was a GP in an area like this, and she longed to be able to refer her patients to baby groups, to church groups, to dementia-friendly groups, but there's just no groups, nothing to refer people to. And I think our approach to levelling up areas like this that are low identity, low capacity and low resource has to be very, very different. And actually we have to take much more of a kind of incarnational approach where outside resource moves in. And I'm really struck by the work of Hilary Cottam. I don't know if anybody is familiar with her book, Radical Help. And she talks about an inner city area where they move a social worker, a police officer, an educational psychologist into the area and work closely and build relationships with people in that area. They build the capacity and they build the resource. And so just to be very brief, because I've been instructed to be so, I think levelling up is absolutely crucial. Obviously it's our mission as a government, but we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think in the neighbourhoods, and we need to call them neighbourhoods, they need an identity where they have very low capacity and low resource. We have to take a very resource-intensive approach to levelling up and build capacity over a number of years.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well done. Thank you very much. Okay, Vidya, over to you. Vidya is the Chief Exec of Power to Change, which is absolutely tremendous organisation. I don't know if you're going to... But it's worth it's absolutely doing such brilliant work in our communities. Doesn't say in your bio here, I don't know why you haven't included this video, but she was an advisor to Tony Blair in an Untitled policy years ago as a civil servant. I'm sure not to Labour. I mentioned it video because I'd be very interested in your perspective on the history of regeneration. We've actually got a lot of learnings we've got from the past couple of decades. So what do you go for?
I'm going to talk about those principles that we have. I think we have learned a lot now about what works on regeneration and turnaround left behind communities. I'll come on to that, but a minute on Power to Change. And interestingly, we provided the funding to enable a community in Stocksbridge to take over the leisure centre. So thank you for that example. An accidental plug. So Power to Change supports communities across the country to create businesses that transform their local neighbourhoods and the lives of the people that live within those. And they vary from leisure centres, as we've heard, to community-led housing, community energy companies, community pubs, community shops. There's a whole range of things that communities in this country are owning and running successful businesses for the benefit of their local communities. We've supported over 1,000 community-led businesses so far and continue to support more in the years to come. And I think there are 4 principles that should inform the levelling up approach. And I think that these come, a lot of this from the work of Onward, the turnaround report and other work is on the social fabric, and from other work that's happened over the last few years to try and understand what we now know about regeneration, and we know quite a lot. So the first is that this levelling up has got to be an economic and a social project. So the value and the importance of social infrastructure the civic assets of a community, the social relationships in a community really matters to it becoming a more prosperous place. So we need to make sure that there is enough focus not just on productivity and the general measures of economic activity that we tend to think about, that we couple those with a focus on the social. Rachel's already talked about this. We really need to take a hyper-local approach to levelling up alongside the bigger picture regional approaches that we're already doing, because people want to see change at the neighbourhood level in the things that they experience, in the ways that they see their place change in their day-to-day lives. The hanging baskets, whether the pub's open or not, whether there's a post office there, whether the bank's still there, the shop, whether there are decent shops, that is the level at which people will judge the success of levelling up. So we need that neighbourhood hyper-local approach to address that. The evidence on regen, and I commend the turnaround report to you because it summarises this really well, shows that community control matters. If we want investment in communities to have lasting impact and to change these places for the long term, we need to have communities deeply engaged and involved in driving some of that change. And incidentally, it's also what people want. We released some polling yesterday which showed that about 2/3 of people want more control over the decisions that affect their lives in their local area. So this is both kind of necessary from an evidence point of view and politically sensible. And fourthly, and really importantly, particularly in those communities Miriam you just described, that lack capacity, we really need to invest in the capacity of those communities, in the later potential of the leaders within those communities, and support them to drive some of this work forward. So I think what I would like to see, and it's kind of heartening that some of the messages coming out from Michael Gove and others over the course of conference have been alluding to this, and this really sort of makes me happy to see things like this, is a pivot now in the approach the government is taking away from a very top-down, centralised approach, communities competing for Whitehall funds, to an approach that really puts trust in the communities to drive some of this change locally. And our experience of how to change is there is huge potential in communities to bring about lasting change in the lives and in the physical fabric of their neighbourhoods. And you don't have to go very far from conference to see that. So you go in one direction to Trafford and you'll find Stretford Public Hall, an incredible Victorian building that was largely unused, was taken over by the community a decade or so ago. They raised capital both from themselves and from grant funders and others to bring that building back into use. It's now a vibrant hub with workspace, art space, community facilities, and has been a real magnet for driving forward the regeneration of Trafford. You go in the other direction, Radcliffe Market Hall in Bury, a really dilapidated, failing market that was taken over by the community, is now vibrant, survived the pandemic, is driving forward regeneration in its area. And just 15 minutes on the edge of Salford, between the city and Salford, Islington Mill, a former Victorian mill, now thriving as an artist collective. Hundreds of artists have worked there, have driven forward the regeneration of that area. So we have these fantastic examples. I commend this report to you that we published a couple of weeks ago. I'm not going to talk about all the recommendations in there, but I'll just focus on one, which is if we want levelling up to succeed, we need not just devolution down at the local level, we need devolution down to the neighbourhood level. We need to put more trust in our communities to take some control of some of the resources that will come through for levelling up, and to be able to shape the way that's used in their local communities. We have to trust that people understand their local places best and give them the power and control to shape those local places going forward. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Okay, so my two favourite organisations, apart from Onward, are Power to Change, for all that work that it has been describing, supporting community businesses, and New Local, for its work we're about to hear about. Local Trust, I get it. I like
we know you
too.
love us, Danny.
New Local too, all right. Local Trust, who lead the Big Local. See how so hard. The Big Local programme, which Alison, I hope you're going to explain what you're doing, because it's better coming directly from her. So Alison runs the.
I run the Little Holton Big Local.
Little Holton Big Local. Little Holton, okay.
Well, I don't run it,
in
I
Salford.
work for it.
Well, she's going to explain it, but basically, but before that, work in a lot of professional experience working in childcare with children and young people, and then working for Little Holton Big Local. Over to you.
Okay, so I'm Alison Jones. I do work for Little Holton Big Local. And our charity, we now have a legacy organisation, Community Little Holton. Little Holton is the furthest bit of Salford before you reach Bolton or Wigan. Anybody saw Educating Greater Manchester? That was our high school. Local residents have said to me, residents on our board, that it feels like a place on the edge. It feels a little bit, it does feel left behind. We have, up at that end, we have a logistics centre, we have Logistics North that actually sits in Bolton, and then we have a town at the end. We're a one road in type of place. It was an ex-mining village when then overspill estates were built around it. People have said to me, well, do you think local residents want to be described as a left-behind community? And I would say, no, who wants to be described as a left-behind community? But I do think people want others to know how it feels. So as a big local, like lots of big locals, we invested in youth provision, working with partners. 2 of our board members, Claire Darlington and Karen Booth, worked every one of those youth sessions, apart from when they were ill or away on holiday, for nearly 3 years. But when we looked for support to strategically continue and sustain that youth club, they couldn't find it. They felt, when we've got the money, yes, you're here, now we want to sustain that provision, we can't see anybody. That sort of behaviour from people in power doesn't encourage community engagement. In fact, it disengages people. The other issue that we had is when we spoke to our young people about our local park, every time we spoke to them, they said something bikeable, something skateable. But when we spoke to Parks Department, they said, everything's on the table but a skate park. Well, one message to communities, I said, if they won't give you a skate park, ask for a pump track. We were able to get a bike track because we formed a relationship with a charity called Access Sport. When I go around and I look at the bike track, I see loads of kids going round that bike track. I actually cycled on a bike for the first time in 15 years. We are a Sports England pilot area. We were not invited as a big local, and our residents were not invited to have a place at the table when it was looking at how that money would be spent. We weren't seen as important. We had 80 odd kids come into a youth club, being active each week, and we had this bike track project bubbling under, but we never got a place at the table. It's not hard to find big locals. There's a website with a whole list of them. If you're working in a big local area, bringing money into it, find out if there's a big local there. They're not hard to find. There are resident-led groups, look for them. Instead of just letting, and all sectors are as bad as each other. I've always worked for the voluntary sector, and we're as bad as each other sometimes, bigger organisations coming in and nabbing the money. Can all play that game. Look, are there resident-led organisations in the area? Go and find them. The other thing I just want to talk briefly about is how it's felt working in what's seen as a left-behind community through COVID-19. Prior to COVID, in our area, there was a food bank, there was a food pantry, and there were several community cafes. We got to August last year, and suddenly the food pantry had to close. So all of those things disappeared. We are Little Holton Big Local, we are community Little Holton. We didn't disappear from Little Holton. We were there, and because we were there, when the pantry closed, we were able to open a food project. And at the height of that food project, at the end of lockdown 3, we had 100 people attending each week, with food reaching 3 times as many. Greens have restarted in the area, but we will have our food club tomorrow, and on previous figures, there will be 70 odd people who will come there to pick up food. We now ask for a small charge if people can afford it, but we will have 70 odd people there. Food isn't as easy to always to get as it has been with that lovely buffet this this afternoon. I would also say that I think some of the key things in terms of community assets are important. We need things rooted in communities that when the going gets tough, do not shrink back away from those communities. First person who ever walked into our hub when we reopened was a refugee asylum seeking woman from the Sikh community who'd just been stuck, here's little Holton, very few other Sikh people in that community, and just had to find her way. We still support her, we supported her through the food club, we're now running ESOL classes. People need physical places to go and get support. It isn't all about online. You need workers who are held to account. I am not a local resident, but I believe that I serve my community well, and when I stop serving my community well, that'd be time for me to go and find another job. Invest money in creating local workforces, and that's, I still think we're not giving that message to enough of our young people. You know, they should be able to achieve anything and go anywhere. You know, there should be a levelling up for our young people.
Fantastic, Alison, thank you. So totally inspirational. Very many thanks. Okay, there's loads there. So we've got 20 minutes or so. So let's go straight into questions, or feel free to make comments. We've got 2 hands up to see what demand for questions is going to be. If we can go one by one. Okay, the second row there. So is there a microphone? Or just raise your voice. Go on.
A question for Rachel.
And your name and where you're
Yeah,
from.
sorry, it's Tony Diver from Telegraph. Question for Rachel. Just picking up on what you said about looking forward to the Levelling Up white paper being published and the sort of official government definition of it. You were obviously co-author of the Tory manifesto, which by my count mentions levelling up at least a dozen times. Is it frustrating for you that it's taken the government this long to define the thing that it was elected on? And do you think that there was a sort of coherent and well understood definition of levelling up in the minds of both the party and the voters back in 2019?
So, yeah, good questions. I think some things have happened since the election, to be fair to the government. So the answer to your first question is no. I think we have had the most extraordinary events over the last couple of years. Certainly went in my head when I was working on the election campaign. And I would not have wanted any politician to have spent less time on COVID in order to spend more time on this. But to go to your second, I think that what there is with the public is not a sense of this term levelling up. Actually, I think the term doesn't tend to do terribly well with the public, but unquestionably a sense of things they want to see changed. So when we do focus groups, do we end up having a vibrant discussion about levelling up? No, but if you mention the high street, you can't get people to stop. And if you mention crime, you can't get people to stop. And so I think there was unquestionably, and still is, a very clear and shared sense about what is wrong in towns and what needs to be fixed, which is why I often focus on some of these kind of smaller and more near-term wins, because I think that does give you permission to carry on. So in that sense, I think there is a completely shared diagnosis. And also, it is not a diagnosis that is unique to particular parts of the north. So whether you go to the north or Midlands or the southwest or actually large parts of the southeast, I think that diagnosis remains the same. So I think there is a coherent desire. And it's a coherent desire that is not impossible to match with coherent policy.
Fantastic, thank you both. Right, snappy questions, snappy answers, people.
Sorry.
No, it's quite okay. In the middle there.
Hi, Ali Amicona from Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. Not actually going to talk about racism though. So this is a question to Rachel. I completely agree with what you said about people feeling left behind and sort of people saying it was better 10, 20, 30 years ago. I'm saying with my family, the Pennines very much a left behind white working class town. And my grandmother voted Tory for the first time in her life in 2019. But what they want to see are real changes by the next general election. And you said that there are solutions that can already be found in places, and there are short-term wins that we already have. But you didn't actually go into any detail on what they were. So what are they, and what can be delivered before the next general election?
Also, great questions. And I'll try and be brief. Sorry, Danny. So I think that the main things you can deliver in the next few years are, number one, the sort of baseline fabric of what towns look like. So it is things like cleaning them up, putting in incentives so that shops reopen, starting to build more basic public transport infrastructure like buses so people can travel between them, restarting things like neighbourhood watches so that you've got more sort of response to crime. So I think those are the relatively near-term things. You know, I should stop there because I'm hogging. There's some.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Brilliant. Front row here.
Adrian Waldridge from The Economist. I'm sorry to keep pestering you, Rachel.
See, we have such amazing panellists.
But I do just want to push you on this point about town regeneration. Because in 2018, about 1 in 25 transactions were on the internet, as it were. Now, 1 in 3 are on the internet. What can your hanging baskets do when you're confronted by this massive gale of creative destruction? Nothing, I would have thought.
No, I actually don't agree with you, or at least I only partly agree with you. We're not going to return to high street that looks exactly the way that they did 30 years ago. That does not mean that there can't be anything on the high street, or that there aren't things that people will still physically go to that are anchors, some of which might be retail, but many of which might be other things. To give one example, we used to have more schools in the centre of town than we do now. So I think there's quite a lot that you can do in terms of civic infrastructure. I will now shut up because I think others have ideas.
Well, Brown's going to come in and then we're going to take some questions from some other people.
Yeah, I'll just cover that point. I had a bit of time a few years ago when I did a 4-year stint in what was then the CLG. I was the High Streets Minister. The point you made is absolutely spot on. The speed with which people have changed into online shopping is a real change for high streets. But this comes back to the point where devolution is so important because local areas will have a better feeling for. She touched on the point Miriam and Rachel have made in different ways about what is needed, not having one size fits all. So again, if I take the phrase I've used for a while is, when I was young, I can still remember on a Saturday my parents would take me shopping, and while we're there we might grab a cup of coffee and a nice bun. Now, you don't do that. As a young person, if you go out to a town centre, you're going for a social activity, you're going for a coffee, and you might pop in a shop. It's completely changed. And high streets need to recognise that and change around that. We did some things in the Housing and Planning Act to give a bit more flexibility to councils to deal with that. And it is about trusting other people, whether it's the town centre partnership, the local authority, whatever it happens to be. And again, in Great Yarmouth, we've got a really good example of how things are different, even in one place. So I've got a town, Great Yarmouth town itself, focused particularly on tourists. A lot of the people you would expect to go shopping in Great Yarmouth town actually go to Norwich or to Galston. Your Great Yarmouth town is predominantly shopping and is now going through, the council investing quite heavily, a big change to try and get away from what's been 11% vacancy rates. Because the shops are too big for the small retailers, the big guys move to Norwich or out of town. It needs to be a different type of town. Galston, in contrast, which is more of a ribbon town, no empty shops, lots of independence, lots of social activity, always thriving, and it's 2-3 miles down the road. And I think it's a really good example of, if you go around the country, and as I did with the town centre, the high streets funds and things like that, the ones that had a predominance of independence, that were changing to meet what we as consumers want, they're the ones that are thriving. But to do that well, you've got to devolve the power to do that.
Brilliant.
So I just wanted to come in on that as well. So I sit on the board of the High Streets Task Force, which Brendan might have been created in your era.
I think
It must have been. I mean, we are seeing really exciting reuse on the High Street, which is not about retail. So the University of Gloucestershire has repurposed the Debenhams on the High Street in Gloucester to be a combined community and learning space, part of the university playing its civic role that Rachel described. We fund a number of community businesses that are moving into empty properties on the high street, but they're not bringing back retail, they're bringing shared workspace, public services, other kinds of uses. The high street is vital as the soul of our communities. It's the place where people come together, and we can reimagine them to be something different apart from retail, and people expect us to, and that's what they're looking for, and we are starting to see it happen. So the death of the high street is about the end of the backbone of retail rather than the death of the high street as a public space.
Yeah, I need residential grid light too.
Yeah. That's what we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, give us residential footfall
Yeah.
and colleges coming in, all of that, all places.
So,
good afternoon. Jess Hanson from the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce. Vidya mentioned about having engaged communities, and Alison, thank you for the work that you do. The people that you work with in those communities, if they hear the expression leveled up, will it resonate with them? Will they? Is that something they would understand? And you know, is it something that they can? I mean, we're in an echo chamber here. We totally get levelling up, but the people that you work with, if you try and explain that expression, is that something that you can that they can take to heart?
I think something has to happen. But I'd say that I have heard the term levelling up. At the moment, what I don't know what that's going to really look like in action. And what I does say, there needs to be action behind it. And that's what people will be looking for. They're not going to be looking at the term. People will take or leave the term. You know, it's going to be, are there going to be any changes?
Thank you, Alex.
And I will say the stuff about high streets. You can tell a high street in a more prosperous area to a high street in a left behind community, and yes, and you can. And I'll show you pictures, and you know you can. I know where I live is a more prosperous area. We do not have a left behind high street. I know in Little Holton we have a left behind precinct.
If I could just briefly come back on that, because I live in a very prosperous area, Petersfield, but the high street is a left behind. It's like a little bit of left behind England spreading to the south now. And I think that's happening right across the south. You're seeing high streets just being boarded up and closed down.
But there are examples of high streets that have changed and are different. And you may have a different type of left behind high street that needs some action. But Prestwich is not a left behind high street if anybody wants to go down the road and have a look at Prestwich.
You need to get stuck in locally, Adrian. You should set up your office in one of the units in your high street. Co-working space. That's what you need. Okay. Right. Lady there in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, Caitlin at the Yorkshire Post. A question for any and all of the MPs on the panel. It seems like a lot of the levelling up headlines quite a lot of the time seem to focus on this is how many jobs, you know, Channel 4 would bring to Leeds or HS2 would bring to Manchester. Do you feel like there is enough focus on what is being done in towns, and if not, when do you think that will come? Will it be something that will spread out?
Well, I asked Miriam to answer for Yorkshire and Paul to answer for the nation.
Well, I certainly think there is a role for spreading out government departments and big infrastructure projects. I think that is important. Whether that will change the fabric of these communities as much as the much more local things that Rachel's spoken about, I would, if I had to choose between the two, I'd go for the local investment. But to come back to the Towns Fund, I think that is a really, really good example of levelling up, because yes, it is significant financial capital help, but the way it's being delivered is through the strength of the community, through consultation with the community. It is the community that has put together the projects that we want to see happen, and then they've been approved by government rather than the other way around. So I think levelling up is defined by partnership rather than being done to, and I think that's what's so important about levelling up. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Oh, sorry, it was just if you think there will be more focus on towns as a result of the projects that are happening.
Yeah, well, I think the principal focus has been on towns so far, and that was the great thing about the Towns Fund. Cities have seen a lot of investment, a lot of regeneration over previous decades. Towns have totally missed out on that. The example I always use is if you live in Croydon and you want to travel into central London, the service is 20 train services an hour, and it takes about 18 minutes. If you live in Penistone and you want to travel to Sheffield, same distance, 1 train an hour, 50 minutes if you're lucky. That's the difference. So the focus has been on towns, I think rightly so, and it should continue to be.
Paul.
It's actually 12 minutes into London Bridge from Croydon. That's why the block of flat Saffron Square is £1 million for the penthouse flat. So we do pay off plan for those kind of things. Look, I mean, the headlines are clearly on those big ticket things about moving the civil service around and those kind of things, which is an important part, because we say as Minister for London, we don't want to be London centric. We want to be in equal partnership with all the cities and the towns. I mean, London does have an unusual case, a peculiar case, in that it's 3 times the size of the next European city, never mind British city. So it has a centre of gravity of its own, just the sheer scale. GTR, the train operating company that does Southern Thames Link, carries 22% of the entire country's rail passengers, just on that one network. So it's a phenomenal scale, but that doesn't, as I say, that's not mutually exclusive. So the headline, so we do need to make sure that the civil servants, the people that are giving us advice, that are working on policy and political thinking, policy thinking, are distributed around and living around the communities, the neighbourhoods, as we rightly describes them as, so that you can get that first view. And what we don't want to do is just shove the civil servants from London to the next biggest city, and then the next biggest city is, we need to make sure. That's why the hubs like Darlington are so important, that we can stretch out in all communities. But they are just the headlines. There's so much work that is needed, that is being done beyond that's dripping down into those smaller communities, those smaller roads, and the kind of networks of neighbourhood activists that was being described by the panel.
Thanks, Paul. Right. Any last questions? Madam in the middle, and then we'll go to the back. No, just try and do all these three so I can see you. Madam, sir, and sir. Second. That's you. Yes, yes, please. No, behind you.
Oh, sorry.
Lady there.
I'm just interested, my name's Beth, I'm from Anglesey, and I'm interested in how the UK government is working with the devolved administrations to achieve levelling up, because a lot of the stuff that you've talked about here today is England.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen in Wales.
Thank you very much. We'll answer that in a second.
Thank you. Martin Bolt, Kirklees Council. One of the ways that we can turn around communities is by access. So travel and community. Miriam's mentioned the deplorable state of Northern Rail. We have a policy on encouraging active travel. So can we ask Brandon or somebody if the government will deliver on its previous manifesto to turn old railway lines into active travel corridors, and then we can get Miriam from Penistone into Sheffield in under 50 minutes by using an e-bike.
Fantastic. Great.
I'm Graham Duxbury. I'm here with the charity Groundwork, which has been doing projects for about 40 years, working in and with communities to deliver neighbourhood regeneration. And where that works best is where you can work alongside people who might be viewed as community leaders. They generally don't view themselves as community leaders, but they might be viewed by others as community leaders. And it's a really difficult role to pull off. Local authorities sometimes are slightly suspicious about the lack of democratic accountability, the job of just representing a massive kind of diversity of views and interests in a local area is really challenging. And one of the lessons from previous schemes, which hasn't been talked about a lot, is quite a lot of people got burnout trying to do that job. So what kind of support can we put in place so that people like Alice and others can perform this role really effectively?
Okay, I'm going to let Video answer that last question, if that's all right. Brandon's going to take on the devolved administration. Have you been a transport minister? You probably not. No. Who wants to talk about travel?
I can cover
Paul.
Okay. Got some experience on this.
Okay, all right. Well, what do you want to devolve?
So okay. Look, on the devolved one, yes, we do work with devolved authorities. In fact, we one of the things the Prime Minister has set up, Michael Gove, a CEO in a new department. I can't stop calling CLG. Having spent 4 years, I'm afraid, but Deluxe, as now is, still does this. We bring the devolved authorities together on a range of issues, actually. Particularly through COVID, that worked very well. So although there's some individual things, and I was having regular sort of pretty much daily meetings with the Northern Ireland executive, we also sort of weekly bring in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales together with us as UK government to have those conversations, so that because the benefit of devolution is that you can look at what is right for any given area. And Northern Ireland is very different. It's got a very unique situation, not just its history, but the fact that it shares a land border with the Republic of Ireland, obviously, particularly COVID meant had to have a different approach, but knowing that, being able to work through that meant that we could communicate that and deal with that properly. So in terms of this kind of devolution, we do that. Michael certainly will be focused on continuing that. We've also got the benefits now of the UK Internal Market Bill from last year. And what the UK Internal Market Bill did, got a lot of attention because of the EU stuff and certain things I had to know what we were going to do. But at least, I'll be very clear, at least we were upfront and honest about what we were going to do. And we did manage to achieve the aim of ensuring that worked. But what UKIN was actually about was actually putting in place that structure of how the UK can work, because that had been part of the EU before. As we leave the EU, that didn't exist. So having that structure that meant that Scotland couldn't ban Bushmills whisky or Penderyn whisky, etc., to protect Scottish whisky or whatever they might want to say. England would do that, but just to make sure there's that proper UK market. What we also did in that was give UK government the ability to do things directly. So we can work with some of these organisations, and I'll very briefly place the last one as well. In a lot of areas, you've got really good organisations who can deliver locally, but don't have the capacity to know how to do that, how to access things. So one of the things we're looking at, certainly in my department, is how we can work with some of the local authorities in Northern Ireland, very different powers to anywhere else in the UK, very much less actually, to have the ability, and local voluntary organisations to be able to take these things on. But we do that for the territorial offices, and together, all three of us, with Michael Gove, to work with all the devolved authorities to join this together.
Almost out of time, so 30 seconds quickly on transport.
Yeah, well, subsidy control is part 2 of the UKIM bill, actually allowing us to spend in and the right governments to spend in their areas. They don't need assisted area maps like European funding, because actually that makes it hard. It's a blunt tool that makes it harder to spend within regions. But there's obviously things like Wilfer, nuclear, and the Freeport and Anglesey.
You've been speaking to Virginia, haven't
Virginia's
you?
been doing loads of work on. But in terms of transport, obviously we're going through a whole load of beaching reversals that Grant Shapps has been talking about. So we want to make sure that we can have the actual trains running in good order in those smaller areas, connecting those areas. But absolutely active travel is something that it's a good aspiration to have. It's something that we still have. There's a great example of London, the Camden High Line in London, which is a good trip looking to restore a railway back to use.
I think Miriam's bidding for some at the moment as well.
Got the Penistone Night. In fact, Kirklees Council have done a fantastic job, and the majority of the work on the Levelling Up Fund bids that I've put in to improve Penistone Line, double the frequency, improve the trains. And I think that kind of those local links are far more important to people in Yorkshire than HS2 or anything like that. They are crucial to levelling up. So, and there are other restoring railways bids in, and they have been delayed because of COVID. But it absolutely still is the intention, and I hope spending with you, we're going to see quite a lot of news on that. So watch this space.
Lastly, video on how we hold
Yeah,
unelected local leaders to account.
So burnout is a real issue, particularly post-pandemic. So as Alison described, these people rooted in their local communities have been the front line of the COVID response, and they are now struggling. So we need to take this seriously. I think the two things that we